Hi everyone, just wanted to take a moment to talk a little bit about congruent figures and how you can identify them and identify their corresponding parts. So, we have talked a little bit about congruence in the past. We have said that segments are congruent. We've said angles are congruent. Now we're going to be putting them all together when we're looking at figures that are congruent. And you've probably heard a little bit about it before when we were talking about transformations, when we were talking about rotations, reflections, and translations, because those are also called congruent transforms, because the shapes, the images, right, from the pre-image, the image and the pre-image are congruent to each other. So that's where you might have heard this as well. All right, so our objectives. We're going to describe how rigid transformations are connected to congruent figures. Now, rigid and congruent, congruence transforms, those mean the same thing. It's just two different names for it. We're going to write congruent statements and identify corresponding parts of congruent figures. Okay. So, what does it mean for two figures to be congruent? Well, two figures are congruent if they have the same size and shape. Okay. Same size and shape. And this is important. They're congruent if there is a rigid motion that maps one figure to another. So what does this mean? Well, rigid motion, that's called a congruence transform. So we can either use a reflection, a rotation, or a translation. Okay, so if I could move this figure around using just these or some combination of them, that means that, and they perfectly line up at some point. That means that these two figures are congruent. So if I could reflect it and then rotate it, or reflect it and translate it, or translate, rotate, then reflect, whatever, some combination of them, and end up on the same spot as the other figure, then these two are congruent. And that's all it means, okay? So they have the same size and they have the same shape. Now, what does that actually mean? They have the same size and the same shape. In two congruent figures, angle measures and side lengths are congruent. That does not mean all three of the sides, or 4 or 5, or however many sides there are in the figure, are exactly the same. So, right, this could be a side length 7, and this could be side length 8, and this could be 9. That's okay, as long as the one over here, the figure it's congruent to, has the same length. So the 7 and the 7 line up, the 8 and the 8 line up, the 9 and the 9 line up. That's what I mean, right? So the side lengths are congruent, or the side lengths are the same, the sides are congruent, and the angle measures are congruent. Now, the order really, 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 really matters in these, right? So I just told you that we have to line up like the things that are the same. So even though these are kind of, well, in this case, it's rotated, these two are the ones that line up, right? Not these two, not those two. These two right here are the ones that line up. Additionally, we can say that the angles are congruent. So, right, again, we have to line them up. So the ones that relate to each other. This angle right here is in the same kind of spot. Remember when we were talking about how angles, when they're in the same spot, we call them corresponding? So these are the angles that are in the same kind of spot of the figures, right? So these two angles are congruent. These two are going to be congruent. So we need to be careful. That order really, 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 really matters here. All right. I am going to be very specific usually when I am writing angles. I'm always going to try and use 3. If I just take it from somewhere, they use 1 sometimes. But if they only use 1 letter, that means there's no question, right? So, I mean, yeah, I know which one angle R is, right? We all know which one angle R is. However, I can't just say, oh, angle T, right? There's 2 angles right here. There's this one and that one. Actually, there's 4 if you deal with the ones outside of the figures. So In T's case, you would have to definitely be specific. R, you would kind of know which one it is. S, you would know which one it is. V, you would know which one it is. U, you would know which one it is. But T, you have to be specific. That's why I like to use the 3 letters throughout to be consistent. So again, segments that are corresponding to each other are congruent. Angles that are corresponding are congruent. And this statement right here, triangle RTS is congruent to triangle UTB. That is a congruent statement, all right? So we have to line things up. R is lined up with U. T is lined up with S is lined up with V, okay? So we need to be careful and line these up. So these are the things we need to focus on writing. And if we write these correctly, we'll be good to go. Okay? So let's actually look at writing congruent statements. So what we're going to do is we're going to say that 2 triangles are congruent. So if I start with S over here, I need to find the other one that only has 1 line over here. Okay. Now, I'm gonna go to the, I'll go to the 2 on this one. So now I have R. R is the 2 one over here. Over here, the 2 one is S. Essentially, I'm dealing with this one as my second triangle. Now I have I for 3 on that one, and T for this one, okay? So we need to be careful. The R and the S are not lining up with each other. S was lining up with R is lining up with S. The R is not with R, S is not with S. We need to be careful when you set these up. All right, let's do another one. I'm just gonna write this down first. So I'm gonna say angle QRP, and let's go from there. So I just said QRP, so I've dealt with this triangle up here. All right, so I need the one that has 2 lines, 2. So that means I'm starting with P. Now I need the one with 3 lines, so D, and then Q has 1, and P has 1. All right, so you need to be careful when we are filling these out. You need to line them up. All right, let's move on to the next thing. Now, as I had stated earlier, corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Okay, so what does that mean? That means the points that line up, if you were to rotate, reflect, or translate, or some combination, those are the same. So angles that are in the same spot are the ones that would be congruent. So you need to be careful and pay attention to which ones are in the same kind of spot, right? So the ones with 1 line are the ones that are congruent. So even though this one's in the bottom left and now this one over on the right-hand side, you would kind of feel like it should be that one. It's this one up here. It's the S. M and S are congruent, right? So that means angle M and angle S are congruent. Now I know that K and T are congruent. So K and T, these are the ones that line up. We know that these 2 are congruent. And then L and L, these 2 angles over here. Now, normally when we're writing something like this, you wouldn't just write angle L. You would have to write KLM and angle SLT or something like that, just so you're specific on which one's which. Further, we know that MK and ST are congruent. We know that KL and TL are congruent as segments. And we know that segment LM and segment LS, they are also congruent segments. So we need to be careful. We can say all of these pieces of information. Last thing, we're going to practice this. We know that triangle TUV is congruent to triangle GFE. We know that angle U is congruent to what? Well, U is lined up with F, so I know that angle F is the angle it is congruent to, so angle F. Now I have segment FD is congruent to what? Well, what do I know? Triangle DEF is congruent to triangle KJI. Well, FD, that's going to be IK, right? So we have FD, IK. So segment IK. Now we have that triangle DEF is congruent to triangle DSR. And I want angle F. What is this angle congruent to? Well, let's follow along. D's corresponds to D's, so these ones, E and S. That means F and R. R. Angle R. Okay, so that's all you're doing with these. When we are practicing these, also know that it's possible you could have to try and figure out, are they congruent by kind of flipping them around and making sure they can move on top of each other. Okay, so please, please, please let me know if you have any questions and have a great day.